All rise. Veuillez vous lever. Please be seated. Veuillez vous asseoir.
Thank you very much and welcome back. Mr. Nduretu, your turn next. May we get an indication as to the time you anticipate taking?
Your Honors, I don't expect to be more than half an hour or so. But I will, in any event, be well within the estimated time.
Fair enough. Just so we can know when to adjourn. Thank you. You may proceed.
Thank you, Mr. President, Your Honors. I begin this opening statement by quoting from a victim, and I quote, "The only right I had and the only mistake I made was to have been present at the scene of commission of the crime," unquote. Through this quote, Your Honors, I hope that your minds will be focused and remain focused on the fact that although the criminal case, and I emphasize criminal, is an adversarial disputation primarily between the prosecution and the defense, the justice case, and again I emphasize justice, includes victims as an integral component of the case, and so to speak, the justice case, therefore, has more than two sides to it. To quote the submission of the representative of the Victims' Rights Working Group at the United Nations Diplomatic Conference of Plenipotentiaries on the establishment of an international criminal court, and now chief of the Victims' Participation and Reparations section at this court, Mrs. Fiona Mackay, I quote, "There would be no justice without justice for victims, and the International Criminal Court must therefore be empowered to address these rights and needs. It would be the court's ability to bring to justice those responsible for the crimes within its jurisdiction that would do most to satisfy the expectation of victims," unquote. Your Honors, these words hold true today as they did in 1998, 4 years before the provisions of the Rome Statute came into force, paving the way for the prosecution and punishment of the most serious crimes known to man. Now, a victim of Kenya's post-election violence of 2007-2008 echoed this position in even more compelling words. And again, I quote, "If there were no victims, there would be no case. If there was no suffering, would there be any reason to accuse the accused? We are the ones who experienced the atrocities. The court sits because there were atrocities and there was pain suffered by the victims," unquote. Mr. President, Your Honors, it was not for nothing that the founders of the International Criminal Court brought victims to the center stage of the criminal justice process. It was in recognition of the fact that international justice would count for nothing if victims were not willing participants in the process of restoration of law, order, peace, and security, which had been threatened by genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity around the world. And it is neither the prosecutor nor the defense that was most deeply affected by the crimes before you. Now, this statement, I know, may at first glance sound unsophisticated, but in it lies the naked truth that it was the victims who bore the brunt of the crimes. They suffered emotional damage and scarring, physical damage and scarring, financial damage and social damage. Neither the prosecution nor the defense can lay claim to having suffered all these types of damage. Where I come from, there is a saying to the effect that unless you have drunk of the cup, in reference to a cup of bitter herbs which you must take as medicine, then you do not know that it is full to the brim. This saying means that it is only a person who has endured an event who truly knows the experience. In other words, while the prosecution and the defense may line up their witnesses to tell the 2007-2008 story, no one can relate the ordeal more vividly than the victims themselves. In common parlance, Your Honors, violence is an act of aggression, generally against a person who resists. Violence may also be said to be a turbulent state resulting in injuries and destruction. Both these definitions belie the real import of violence, the infliction of emotional and physical damage and shock with long-lasting effects. Your Honors, the process of becoming victims was an unwarranted and gross invasion into the self. And I borrow here from Professor Gerd Ferdinand Kirchhoff of the Graduate School of Victimology, Tokiwa University, Japan, in order to bring home this senseless, gross invasion to the self. Now, imagine an onion with its brown and tough outer peel. When you remove it, you get to more tender parts of it. These are parts that have never seen the sun, parts which are softer. The deeper you go, the softer the material. The softer the material, the more sensitive it is to intrusions. The more sensitive to intrusions, the easier it is to intrude. The less protected, the more pain is produced by the intrusions. Now, in the center of the onion lies the real self. Your Honors, this model of the peeling of the onion by Professor Kirchhoff demonstrates how, prior to the post-election violence, the victims I represent lived protected in themselves. They thought that they could themselves determine what happened to them. That, indeed, is the way we all think when our personal dignity and integrity of the self are intact. We then have a sense of self-worth. And as an aside, I may say that I know exactly what I'm talking about, being myself a survivor of the 1998 US Embassy bombing in Nairobi. Now, the victims of the violence, however, eventually ended up being exposed to the grabbing invasions of the perpetrators of the violence, and they were stripped naked to the very inner core of their self. And now, close to 6 years since the violence, these victims have continued to be stripped of their dignity and have felt and continue to feel insecure and unprotected. Insecure because they do not know if they can ever again trust their own neighbors, and live among them. Unprotected because the government and its machinery have sidestepped their responsibility to bring to justice those responsible for the heinous crimes. Unprotected by a government whose very raison d'etre is to help victims. Mr. President, Your Honors, this can hardly be a way to live. People everywhere must live feeling secure and protected anywhere. They must live peacefully and meaningfully with their sense of self-worth intact. And Your Honors have the task to make this a reality. In making this a reality, it serves well to remind Your Honors that many of the victims I represent are victims of repeat victimization. In some cases, going back to the pre-election ethnic cleansing episodes of 1992 and 1997. Residents of the Rift Valley province of Kenya bore the brunt of ethnic cleansing in those two episodes, as they did yet again in 2007-2008. In the 2007-2008 episode, and as noted in the confirmation decision, the violence included hundreds of deaths, and in the Rift Valley, it was the largest share of deaths and injuries, and approximately 400,000 forcibly displaced persons. Your Honors, I have talked about earlier episodes of violence to bring into context the plight of victims who are of relevance to this particular case. They have suffered repeat victimization, not only as a result of the direct violence I have just talked about. Sadly, they are now suffering repeat victimization in a new form which is well on its way to refinement. This is as a result of subtle silencing by ethnic communities to which the victims themselves belong, and by a political reality which makes it unfashionable to bear the tag of victim and therefore to participate effectively in the criminal justice process. This repeat victimization is being further spurred by the general public and the media, and it is fashionable to hear virtually every other day that, quote, Kenyans have moved on, unquote, meaning that they have decided to abandon any avenues for justice and instead have chosen to forget the atrocities committed in 2007-2008. This begs the questions: 1, who are those Kenyans who have moved on? 2, are victims of the post-election violence Kenyans? And 3, have they abandoned their quest for justice? Your Honors, victims therefore need to find meaningful justice in the proceedings before this court, in which they are recognized as integral participants in the criminal justice system with effective rights, including the right that I now exercise on their behalf, which is to meaningfully participate in the proceedings, the right to an expeditious criminal justice process, as well as the right to protection from intimidation and harassment, and the eventual right to seek and obtain reparations. Short of this, Your Honors, the criminal justice process will remain faceless, where the proceedings are only between the prosecutor and the defense. This, indeed, has been the reality of most domestic criminal justice systems, and the victims I represent look up to you to counter their neglect in the criminal justice system and to usher in a truly victim-centered international criminal justice system. Honorable judges, demands for accountability from the domestic justice system by the 628 victims who are within the scope of the case, another 839 victims whose status is currently under review, and the thousands of victims of the situation whose plight fell on the deaf ears of the Kenya government and have had their rights remain unaddressed for close to 6 years now. Accordingly, it is with a measure of hope and expectation that participating victims, and through them all within the larger victim population, that they now look up to you in their search for truth and justice. They look up to you to remove from them the tag that they are the red-headed stepchild of the criminal justice process. They have traveled a long road and witnessed many attempts at scuttling the criminal justice process, including lukewarm investigations and prosecutions domestically, pleas by the Kenya government for deferral of the ICC process, threats at withdrawal from the Rome Statute by Kenya and other African states, withdrawal of victims and witnesses from the ICC process, and delays related to the commencement of the trial. The victims have many a time voiced their concerns that the trial was taking far too long to commence, and feel that through you, they can now walk along the road from, I quote, justice denied to justice restored, unquote. Mr. President, Your Honors, being a victim in Kenya today is a difficult task, emotionally, physically, socially, economically, and politically. Many victims of the post-election violence have feelings of self-blame, anger, shame, sadness, or denial, or a combination of all these. Many others are enraged by the threat to their safety and security. The emotional impact and the physical effects of victimization have come to be a symbol of disgrace or infamy. The hundreds of victims that I represent today, and many more hundreds of thousands of them who make up the total victim population arising out of the post-election violence, never expected to be victimized. They believed that a new dawn had come to Kenya, the East African country, as a result of peaceful elections that had been conducted in the year 2002. Yet, sadly, that was not to be. The events that followed the 2007 general elections dashed the hopes of the Kenyan citizenry. And as Kenyan citizens take stock of the post-election violence, many of them have, in retrospect, come to realize that they or someone they know was directly affected by the violence. The ravages of the violence continue to haunt virtually every Kenyan soul, as they do also threaten regional and, by extension, global peace and security. One only needs to recall the effects of the 1994 Rwanda genocide on the Democratic Republic of Congo to see how violence in one country can so significantly affect and detrimentally sow peace in another country. The violence of 2007 and 2008 affected the lives of many people, including many women, children, and the elderly. And as I make this statement, many people will no doubt recall how the violence affected and continues to affect the lives of people close and dear to them. There are many children who remain forgotten, but whose lives were drastically and brutally affected by their witnessing death, human injury, and material destruction, and other dangerous conditions that exposed them to the potentiality of harm from known and unknown sources. Many of them were disrupted at school and in their neighborhoods, and effectively compelled to move from neighborhoods and neighbors that they were familiar with to a life of living in tents, with their parents having to wait for handouts from charitable organizations and well-wishers. These child victims, along with their parents, were stripped of their sense of personal dignity. Their trust in the world, in spirituality, in deeply held beliefs about social order, justice, and humanity was fundamentally upset and replaced with cynicism, suspicion, and resentment for humanity. Through this trial, Mr. President and Your Honors bear the burden of reaffirming the international community's faith in the goodness of humankind by administering justice and thereby positively influencing the emotional recovery of the victims represented in these proceedings, including the many women and children and other vulnerable groups. It is a long road to recovery, beset by legal, political, diplomatic, and other intrigues. In short, it is by no means a light burden, but one which you must fully and effectively discharge if the victims are to achieve any meaningful measure of recovery. Honorable judges, the story and plight of the children I have just talked about, who one might refer to as children of a lesser God, is largely unknown to the criminal justice system, as children are